So.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you for joining us tonight. You guys all know me. I'm Kathleen Eaton, overseeing interpretation here. And I think you guys know where the restrooms are, and you're already members, so you're doing great. You're doing all the things right. So welcome tonight to our presentation with Jennifer Koshatka Seman. She received her doctorate in history from Southern Methodist University in 2015, and she currently is a lecturer in history at Metropolitan State University in Denver. Borderlands Curanderos.
Yeah, good.
The Worlds of Santa Teresa Ria and Don Pedrito Jaramillo is her first book, and it was published by the University of Texas Press in 2021. It was a finalist for the Colorado Book Award in 2022 in the category Biography, and it won the Americano Parades 2022 Book Award. Jennifer teaches courses in U.S. and Latin American history at Metropolitan State University of Denver and lives with her husband, Michael Seman, in Loveland, Colorado. So thank you for presenting for us tonight, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Kathleen. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming. I'm excited to share about my research and my book. And so what I plan to do for you is I put together some slides that will just give kind of a general overview of the history that I talk about, the major themes of this book. Borderlands Curanderos, The Worlds of Santa Teresa Urrea and Don Pedrito Jaramillo is sort of a dual biography. It looks at these two healers or curanderos from Mexico who crossed the border into the United States in the turn of the century, the late 1880s. And then they continued to heal and sort of attract audiences on the US side of the border. So before I talk about them and their stories and what the book says, just thought I'd define some terms. So some of you may be familiar with curanderismo or have heard of it or not, but just a definition. So curanderismo is a hybrid system of healing. It's practiced in Mexico, Latin America, or really any place where people of Latin American descent, Mexican descent have a presence, like the Borderlands, even parts of Colorado. It comes from, the word curanderismo comes from the Spanish verb curar, meaning to heal. So curanderismo, healing, just very basically curing. And it comes from a history, and so in the beginning of the book, in the introduction, I talk about the deeper history of the practice of curanderismo, coming from that contact between Spaniards, Native Americans, and even Africans in the early years of contact. There's cultural mixing, and there's conflict, and there's a lot of things, but a lot of things are born in that. So that's kind of its deep background. The techniques of curanderos vary. Many different techniques depending on the healer, depending on where they're from, but typically curanderismo involves that use of the hands, laying on of hands, sometimes the transmission of energy through the hands, the earth, spiritual healing, different conceptions of we call faith healing, herbs, and really a belief that the healer has a special gift, that the curandero or the curandera has been given a gift called a don, D-O-N, and so the power of their healing comes through that gift. So that belief in that is an important part of curanderismo. These two healers, Teresa Urrea, this is a picture for when she's very young, probably 17 or 18 in that picture, and Don Pedrito Jaramillo practiced their healing or their curanderismo in the US-Mexico borderlands around the turn of the century, again, the period about the 1880s to the early 1900s. They crossed the border at different places, so they didn't know each other during their lives. I've just pulled their lives together in this biography, and for different reasons they left Mexico, but again, garnered attention and audiences on the US side of the border because of their healing. I wanted to kind of also define one more term for us before I kind of launch into the stories here. So Borderlands is a place, but also an approach to the study of the past. So I want to talk about both of those briefly because they inform kind of my thinking and my arguments in this book. So the Borderlands is a place, as I define it and I see it in this work, is this region here. So northern Mexico, the northern Mexican states there in the green, and then the southwestern, basically the southwestern portion of the United States with the border going through it. So it's this broad region that the book focuses on and where these healers traveled. So here, Sonora, so Teresa Urrea was from Sonora, Mexico. She's born in Sinaloa, but became a famous healer in Sonora, and then she crossed the border into Arizona, also lived in Texas for a bit, and then went to California. Don Pedrito comes from Jalisco, Mexico, which is down here, and he ended up crossing the border into Texas, and in this region, the Rio Grande Valley of Texas is where he kind of set up shop and became a healer. So just kind of orienting us in space. I like maps, I always need them. But then back to the point about Borderlands as an approach to studying the past. So I'm a trained Borderlands historian, and what we do that's maybe different than other historians is rather than historian of Mexico or historian of the United States or of a particular topic, Borderlands history looks at the interactions between nation states, i.e. United States and Mexico, and indigenous nations as well. And it shows the interconnections between those sovereignties, we might say, and those polities. So it gives a different kind of perspective. I think as a Borderlands historian, that looking at history this way allows you to see new things and new connections. And so that's what I hope the book does. That's what I was trying to do with the book, is to use the lives of these two healers to show what might not be seen, what might not be visible, and looking at just one history or the other. So three themes, just a little more introductory material here that I try to situate the stories of these two healers in. So when I was transitioning from having a dissertation, which is very, very academic, to a book that I wanted to be engaging and narrative and people would want to read, but also had to be somewhat academic. What I wanted to do is to connect the stories of their lives, like their small stories, their stories of healing, their worlds, their lives, into these bigger historical changes going on at the time they lived. How did they navigate those, and how did they kind of maybe shape those things? So three things that I look at. First, in this period, again, turn of the century, we see a rise of nation building and state power from both the United States and Mexico. Both nations at this time were, again, turn of the century in particular, were wanting to modernize, to progress. Progress was the key word, right? And how to do that often was to take in westward expansion for the United States and in Mexico for development of some of their fringe areas, was to take indigenous land and develop it for commercial development, bring foreign development in, and take that land from indigenous people. Both Mexico and the United States were doing this. That was a part of progress, right? If you think of the train coming across the West. So that's a theme in the background that I engage. Secondly, the rise of professional medicine. So also in this period, we see the American Medical Association, the premier association of medicine, formed in 1848 at the very beginning, but also lots of state medical societies in Texas especially, which is where I did some research. And basically what medicine is doing in this period is you've got lots of different kinds of healers, homeopathic healers, all curanderos, indigenous healers, a lot of quacks and frauds, yes, but a lot of just different we call alternative medicine. In this period, professional medicine wasn't what it is today. They were fighting for authority as the authority for medicine. And so part of what they did was to ferret out other kinds of medical practitioners and prove they were frauds to increase their authority. One of the healers that I look at, Don Pedrito, was at the receiving end of some of that. And so I engage his history in that way as well. And then third, religious movements. In Mexico, at this time, the Catholic Church was very much in bed with the Mexican government of Porfirio Diaz, And there were several groups of Mexicans that didn't like this. There was a lot of unrest in Mexico in this period about the president, Porfirio Diaz, who had gotten himself elected so many times. He'd been in power for 30 years. He was basically ruling Mexico with an iron fist. So there was all these pools of resentment of him, his power, and the Catholic Church together. So Teresa Urrea, especially, was a critic. She was one of these critics of the Catholic Church and all these kinds of power. So I kind of talk about that. You can't really understand some of the things that she says about priests unless you sort of understand this bigger critique of the Catholic Church in Mexico. So that's one of the religious contexts. And then also spiritualism and spiritism, these two religions that are really quite interconnected. So broadly, they kind of are complicated that I learned trying to figure out exactly what they believe, but basically the belief that in trance sessions and in seances, gifted mediums could communicate with the dead and bring messages back to the living. This movement really came to rise in the 1840s in the United States, and especially after the Civil War, where there was so much death and people wanted to communicate with the dead. But as a religion, it had a very complex sort of set of beliefs about how you could access the power of the spirit world and how that power could heal and how it could make you be a better person and make the world better. So very reform-minded. And it may seem strange to us now, but these were really popular religious movements. They, again, may seem awkward and fringe and like, that was just a handful of people, but there was a significant amount of people, and they both interacted with these healers as well. So those are the kind of the big themes that I weave through the book to talk about these healers. Okay, so make sure I'm on the right page. So that's my introduction to kind of the broadly what the book does. So it's separated into two parts. One about Teresa Urrea, and then the second part about Don Pedrito Jaramillo. So first I want to give a little bit of background on Teresa Urrea. This is a picture of her, probably taken in maybe the late, like 1899 or 1900, I'm not sure. So she, at 16 years old, she had a near-death experience. And as witnesses say, as the story goes, she had convulsive attacks, lost consciousness, went in and out of consciousness, and at the end of this sort of traumatic experience, where at one point they thought she was dead, she comes back to life, and then she explains that she had visions and that she heard voices during this time. And it was after this experience where she went through this, had these visions, heard a voice that she claims, or the sources say she claims the Virgin Mary was telling her that she'd been given the gift to heal. And so this was her moment of the gift. In Curanderismo, this is called the dawn. And this is where a healer like Teresa Urrea gets their power. So believers in Curanderismo believe that you only have the power if you have the dawn, the gift, and you have to have this experience. It's usually a near-death experience or something supernatural, traumatic, when you are enlightened and have this happen. So she was 16 years old when this happened to her, living on her father's ranch in Sonora, Mexico, northwestern Mexico. After this, she claims to be able to see people, by seeing people where she could see their sickness just by looking at them. And then she could heal by laying on hands. So her healing is often described as the use of her hands, but she would also prescribe sometimes herbal remedies or herbal concoctions. She would sometimes use mud, she'd use the earth, or she would use her own saliva also at times and mix those together. So I want to share just a couple of stories of her healing. So when I was researching this, one of the most fascinating things that was to hear these stories of their healing. And I'll go through it here, but so many, thousands and thousands of people testified or witnessed that she healed this way and that it was successful. And of course, as a historian, it's not for me to judge. I can't judge the efficacy. All I can assess is, well, people believed this, right? Something was going on there. So these healing stories, I think, are really kind of interesting. The very first person that Teresa Urrea healed after her dawn experience, according to witnesses, was a young Indian girl, an indigenous girl. I don't know from what tribe, the sources don't say, but this young girl was brought to her for healing because one of her legs was shorter than the other. And so she could not fully plant her foot on the ground, and it made it difficult for her to walk. So according to witnesses, Teresa took her leg and she rubbed her knee. She stretched out her shrunken leg and then commanded her to throw away the stick she had used to support herself and walk. According to witnesses, the young girl did as Teresa commanded and was able to plant her foot firmly on the ground and walk well after this. I love this story for a couple of reasons. First of all, it reveals one of her techniques, which is the use of her hands, and also it reveals the kind of authority that she could have to say very much a Christ-like healing, put down your cane and walk, right? The kind of faith that is involved in that. But it also is telling that it's a young indigenous girl that she healed, because Teresa Urrea was herself part indigenous. Her mother was Tehueco Indian, one of the groups in northwestern Mexico, and her father was mestizo, mixed Mexican. She lived among indigenous people. She was an advocate for them, and she would speak out for them in defense of them against the Mexican government. So her history with indigenous peoples is really important, and it sometimes has been buried in some of the stories of her healing. So I love that particular story about her for those reasons. And a couple other stories that I want to share too from her are that show the two different things that she healed with. So let's see this one here. So this is another newspaper account of her healing. This journalist says that she healed a man. A man was brought to her. Basically, friends were carrying him, like on a stretcher or something. He couldn't walk. The story was he worked in the mines, and mining was, working in the mines was one of the major ways that people made a living in this region. He had suffered an injury, couldn't walk, hadn't been able to walk for several years. So they brought him to, as they were calling her, Santa Teresa, to see if she could heal him. He believed he was incurable. So her cure was that she drank water, spat it out on the dirt, and then mixed the water and the dirt into a kind of poultice and applied it to the man's wound. The witnesses claimed he was instantly cured and could walk after that. And so that story, that healing story shows, yes, her techniques, that she used water, she used her saliva, right, and like very, very earth-based, right, and then again, the faith that he was instantly cured and he could walk. And it also, of course, reveals the kind of people that she healed, workers, laborers, indigenous people. The critiques of Teresa Urrea often came from elites in Mexican society. The Mexican newspapers from Mexico City that would come and see what's going on up here. We're hearing stories of this girl healer everyone's talking about. Hundreds, some sources say thousands of people were going to the ranch, her father's ranch, every day just to see her or lay on hands. So she's getting this attention, kind of becoming a little bit of a celebrity. Stories are even repeated in newspapers in the United States. But you'll see in these newspaper accounts that they talk about her and the people that surround her as ignorant and superstitious, and they don't know any better, and they're all idolaters because they're Catholic. Very, very dismissive kind of tones. But according to like all these sources, right, thousands of people came, so someone saw something in her. One more story about her healing that I think is really interesting. A woman was brought to her who had a hemorrhage in one lung. I'm not sure exactly how they knew that, but that was the illness. One witness describes Teresa saying this to her: "I am going to cure you with blood from my own heart." And thereafter she took saliva, in which appeared a drop of her blood, apparently, mixed it with the earth and applied it to the middle of this woman's back. The result was that the hemorrhage was at once controlled, and then the woman was cured. So the stories that get repeated again and again and again are these really interesting stories, and of course they're always successful. You know, now, were there stories that weren't successful? Probably, but the ones that we hear again and again are these kinds of stories that reveal these things. So news of these cures are spreading. Within a year, there's reportedly, again, 500 to 1,000 people coming to Cabora. This is a remote part of northwestern Mexico. It's a ranch, big hacienda. You know, not driving, but on horseback and buggy to see her. She's becoming known in this region of Mexico, but as a santa, as a saint. However, not sanctioned by the Catholic Church. She's critical of the Catholic Church. This is what is called a folk saint or a people saint. The people have decided that she's a saint and that God's working through her. So they're calling her La Santa de Cabora, the Saint of Cabora, which is the name of the ranch that she lives at, or just Santa Teresa. So that's kind of the healing part of her story. Now, in just some more images of her, I have a couple more. And you see the kind of Catholic iconography that someone, so this picture of her originally didn't have the cherubs or like the angels around her. Someone later added those things. I love this. Talk about an archival find. So there's lots of pictures of her just in the black, with that very, you know, kind of simple, her hair back. And someone, I couldn't find out, who took this picture and resold it, but added all this different iconography around her, just kind of showing how people saw in her something. Maybe she herself didn't see herself that way. She would say, I don't like to be called a saint, I'm nothing special. But if people believe that, it's fine. I'll let them say that. So in the first chapter of the book, I talk about these healing stories, and then I look at her political activism. So one of the things about women's history, especially in Mexican history, that overlaps, and in women of, you know, poorer, right, women of color, is that they're not seen as important political actors. They're just kind of doing the things they're supposed to be doing, staying in the shadows. Maybe you can be a healer, that's okay, but they're not involved in politics. That's the men's world. But she was kicked out of Mexico on the orders of the president of Mexico. Porfirio Diaz ordered her to be expelled from the country. He told her, her father and her, you leave, you either go down to the Yucatan, far, far, far from this region, or you go across the border and never come back. Because of the energy and the people that were coming to her to be healed and the things that she was saying as well. So this gets to kind of the political part of it. So this picture is her in El Paso, Texas in 1896. And you see here, you know, surrounded by women. I think she's probably blessing babies, laying hands on them, new babies, because she, again, you see the kind of reverence in the faces of the women around her. So why was she kicked out of Mexico? I'll go over this briefly because it's quite a story, but basically, in the region that she was healing in, this was a region that the Mexican government, under, again, Porfirio Diaz, wanted to develop this land, coastal land, right on the Gulf of California, as a port, and also as an end of a railroad that would come through Texas, come through the United States, and come through then Mexico and Sonora. Wanted to bring all kinds of external finance to support this, but the only way that he could do this was to get access to that land, which was all the homelands of the Yaqui, Mayo, and other indigenous people. This region is heavily indigenous, and they weren't letting go of their land. They wouldn't. They were fighting the government, and actually this fight had been going on since probably the 1850s, even before when it was a Spanish colony. But the fight against indigenous people really ratcheted up in this period. Porfirio Diaz would come in, or have his henchmen come in and murder people. I mean, it's a really, really very, very awful story. So Teresa Urrea is there healing these people and saying things to them like, you don't have to give up your lands, they're your lands, God gave them to you. You don't have to give them up to the government, a corrupt government. She would also say things like, you don't have to confess your sins to priests. you can confess them yourself to God. This is, of course, I grew up Catholic, right? This is, of course, right, not the way that it is in a very Catholic country, and again, the power structures in Mexico, the Catholic Church and the government. So here she is getting on the wrong side of the government by frustrating their projects with indigenous land, and then on the wrong side of the priests. And she knew exactly what she was doing. One interviewer, one American doctor came in to observe her and interviewed her, and he quotes this. He says, quote, "She said that doctors and priests wanted to get her into an asylum or a convent, as she was curing the most obstinate cases of disease and exposing the hypocrisy and fraud of priests." So all of these institutions, the government, priests, and doctors, she's on the wrong side of all of them, right? She's a woman. God help her. Right, so you see just her life exposes all these interesting things. So she's, for these crimes, right, she's expelled from Mexico, as I said. She crosses the border in 1892 with her father and lots of family. They kind of set up shop on the other side of the border. She continues to heal. People continue to come to her from Mexico. She garners new people coming in from across the United States. And there are rebellions. I don't have pictures of this, but in 1896, when this picture is taken in El Paso, there is a rebellion that is staged on the US side of the border in El Paso and border towns against the Mexican government. There's an attempt to overthrow the government of Porfirio Diaz in 1896. And she's a part of this. The rebels that stormed the customs houses on the Mexican side of the border, proclaiming they're gonna overthrow the corrupt government, say, "Viva la Santa Teresa," and on their bodies they have pictures of her. She would claim she had nothing to do with it, but all the evidence points to the fact that she's connected with this. This, of course, is again a very obvious example of her political activity. And also shows that she's a part of this pre-revolutionary energy in the borderlands. So if you're familiar with the Mexican Revolution that started in 1910, before 1910, when it officially broke out, and that's officially what got Porfirio Diaz out of power, but decades before that, you had people like Teresa Urrea, the Flores Magón brothers, being exiled from Mexico and then setting up shop on the US side of the border, publishing newspapers, talking about the evils of the Mexican government. So it's so much interesting history there. She's part of it, right? She's a part of that history. And that's sort of what I talk about in terms of her healing. Just a few more things about her, and then I'll move on to Don Pedrito. She, in the second the second chapter I have on her, I talk about when she left kind of the immediate borderlands and moved to Santa Barbara. She lived in San Jose, and she lived in San Francisco for some years, and then she also traveled across the United States to St. Louis, New York City, and it came back to LA, and eventually came back to Arizona, where she died. So the second part of the book on her looks at her time away from that kind of more immediate political context that she was in, and where she would perform on stages as a healer, which was popular in that period. You'd have clairvoyance and, medicine shows, that's the context, and she would perform her curanderismo, her healing on stage. Super interesting part of her life, but want to move on to Don Pedrito. Just a little bit more to say about her. She died at age 33 of tuberculosis, very young, 33 years old. She died of tuberculosis, which was one of the major killers of people in that time period. Very interesting. So I want to give even time to Don Pedrito Jaramillo, and then time for any questions or discussion. So then, the second part of the book looks at this other curandero, Don Pedrito Jaramillo. And so here he is, this picture. I love this picture. I have better pictures of Don Pedrito, but this is him right here. We don't know who took this photograph. It was shared with me by a woman who's a historian in the community that he's from, and she's got all these cool artifacts and things. So what I love about this picture of Don Pedrito is you see him healing right with his people, right in his community. some unique things about Don Pedrito. So he was much older than Teresa Urrea when he got his don, or his gift. Probably not until his 50s or 60s. And it's really, I don't know, and why he left Mexico, Jalisco. There's lots of kind of tall tales about it. Probably he was a part of a group of men that were selling tequila and mezcal and things like that. He's from Jalisco, and there was a market for that in the Texas, because of the Mexican population there for all their celebrations. So probably that's how he came, and he was also a healer and did that as well. But once he got there, again to the Rio Grande Valley, so he's again that far eastern Texas-Mexico border. So if this is Texas coming down here, the Rio Grande, way down here, the lower Rio Grande Valley, 70 miles from the border is where his ranch, he eventually had a ranch, a small ranch. To that picture. So, so a little bit about his way of healing. As you can see here, not only did he heal people, but he fed them, he took care of them, he didn't charge for his cures. If people came to him, wealthy people, which were there many kind of wealthy people that would just give him land, grants of land. He would grow things on that land, beans, corn, and make tortillas, hire people to make food. People would come, he'd have them get out of the hot sun and eat something, drink some coffee, drink some water before they would come see him. Sometimes people would come to him simply to get some rest or get some food. And this, of course, happened over time. His healing style was very different than Santa Teresa's healing style. So his healing style was that he would assess someone very quickly. Someone would come to him with whatever it would be, and he'd very quickly, rapido, this is what it is, and write on a receta, a little prescription, drink 3 glasses of water before you go to bed every night, the next 3 nights, say 3 Hail Marys. Like, it would be something, lots of threes, lots of drinking water, some little recipe to do something, and then you'll be healed. Eat an onion before you go to bed. Get up in the morning. One of the cures, and there's all these documented cures that are so interesting. One is drink 3 shots of tequila every morning. I'm like, oh, that's gonna kill whatever's in there, right? But his cures were about simple things: water, onions, herbs, lots of herbs, but things that were growing around in the valley, things that people could easily access and would know about. A lot of it was take a bath, take 3, like kind of these ritualistic sort of cures. So not, to my study, no real documentation of him touching anyone. It's all this kind of, he sits here, writes the receta. So that was his style. People love Don Pedrito. Still his legacy in the Rio Grande Valley among people is very, very strong. And it's because of these things, because he was, again, an efficacious healer. By all the accounts of people, his cures worked, often when doctors didn't. That's a big kind of motif that runs through. And again, when he was given gifts and money, he would put that back into the community, and sort of taking care of his community. He bought the church bell, the first church bell for the town of Falfurrias, and that's a really important thing in these early towns, frontier towns, the church. The church is not just where you worship, it's that, but it's where you go. The bell sounds people in, not just for services, but also if something's happening. So like having a church bell was a point of pride for a town, very expensive, so he just kicked in all the money for that from the things he'd gotten. Just one example of one of the things that he did just to serve his community. And one more thing, these maps, so just a little bit of the behind the scenes historian work to share with you. So I could only do this research because so many people shared things with me. When I would give talks, share a little bit of my research along the way, in places like Texas and communities, people would say, I know something, right, and share their stories with me. And the best part of doing this, so I was still a graduate student, giving a talk about Don Pedrito, the little bit that I had done. And this man, Homero Vera, who lives down in the Rio Grande Valley, he said, there's a map. This is the map of the Rio Grande frontier, Texas, from 1890. He said, there's this map you have to see. And the reason you have to see it, I know it's hard to see here, but the circle here is Los Olmos. That's where Don Pedrito's ranch was. And it's only about 70 miles down here to the border, to kind of where Brownsville here, so just for context. But if you look closely at that, Los Olmos is like, it's still a town, but there's maybe 50 people that live there. I mean, it's tiny, and it was even tinier in this period. But look at all of the roads going into and out of Los Olmos. This is what Homero pointed out to me. And if you would look closely like at Corpus Christi, or even San Antonio, much bigger cities, there would be maybe just a few more roads than this. So, you know, of course what Homero was sharing with me is that Don Pedrito was significant. Like, people made the roads going back and forth to him. If you didn't know about Don Pedrito the Curandero over at Los Olmos, you look at this map and go, well, what the heck is going on at Los Olmos? My father grew up in a town in Iowa, a farming town, and I think there's maybe today 250 people, right? It's like, but it's even smaller than that. It's like Protivin, Iowa. I tell people from Iowa, they're like, I've never heard of it, right? Los Olmos is like that, so why, in a map, a professional surveying map, would you have those roads? Well, it's because of the work that Don Pedrito did and how powerful it was. And so one of the arguments I make then is, so he kind of did what the state failed to do, what the government failed to do to take care of the community. And a really great example of this is in the 1890s, there's a terrible flood, or I'm sorry, not a flood, a drought in South Texas. It's horrific. There's stories in newspapers of cattle dying, desiccating, where people are just cutting out the tongue because it's the only thing that they can salvage on it. It's a tough time in Texas, South Texas. And so the government is trying to distribute like just rations of bean and corn to feed people. And they choose Los Olmos, they choose Don Pedrito's ranch as a distribution point for South Texas because of the work he's already doing, right? Like he's already doing these things, and he was already actually doing things feeding people, but now, right, it's a central point. So really cool discovery as a historian when you're trying to think, you know, is he important to history, right? Are these two curanderos I'm looking at, can I make an argument that they're significant and that their lives tell us something? Of course, I wanted to believe that, but I have to have the evidence to back it up as a historian. So love this piece of evidence shared with me, again, by Homero Vera. Just a few more things about Don Pedrito. So in the last chapter of the book, In the Clutches of Black Magic, I look at the later period of Don Pedrito's life, and especially I look at the case against him. So the American Medical Association makes a case against Don Pedrito that he's doing fraud. He's a fraudulent healer. They're kind of making the accusation that he's using the post office for fraud because he's also getting all these letters. People will write him letters asking for cures, and sometimes they'll put stamps within those letters for him to nail back his receta. So the post office is noticing these letters are going out from Los Olmos, but there's no postage being sold. So that's the kind of thing that sparks this investigation into fraud, because a lot of the medical fraud in this period was mail fraud. You want to be cured of cancer? Buys medical compound, right? Send me $20 and I'll send you this. Like, that happened all the time. So there was absolutely legit fraud happening. People were defrauded of their money all the time. So that was where the investigation started. However, Don Pedrito was not doing that. But there's also a lot of attention on him, or some attention on him, because of his successful healing practice, because doctors in this period, in this region, weren't making a lot of money. So part of the kind of professionalizing of medicine and having, you know, medical associations that would protect your salary and things was to get a better salary, and you wouldn't have to compete with these homeopaths and these other healers. So it's part of it as well. In any case, the person that defends Don Pedrito against this case of fraud is this man here. And this is a very young Jose Tomas Canales, or JT Canales. So JT Canales is a really major figure in the history of Texas and Mexican-American history. Canales is the founder of LULAC, or the League of United Latin American Citizens, which is like the Latino NAACP. He's one of the founders of that. And many other organizations. He came from a very wealthy Mexican-American family who had a land grant going way back to Spanish times, so he was very educated, had a lot, came from a very, high status family. He was trained as a lawyer. I think Michigan law school is where he went and came back to the Borderlands. He was a state representative for his region in Texas, and probably the most famous thing he did was that he put his life on the line when he charged the Texas Rangers for their killing of Mexican descent people, the Borderlands region, just killing sprees. And he really almost lost his life doing this. So he's an interesting guy that stands up for his community. And here, so imagine also my joy when I found out Jose Tomas Canales defends the curandero and studying Don Pedrito Jaramillo. It was a fun connection to make. So he, neatly gets all the charges dismissed. He's a brilliant lawyer. He never charged first cures. You can't prove he did, so those charges were dismissed. So there's that part of the story. And then he defends Don Pedrito one last time. After Don Pedrito has been dead for a while, this crazy story comes out in the Spanish language paper La Prensa in San Antonio, and it's also published in Los Angeles. And basically, so this is like 1929. Don Pedrito died in 1907, so this is well after his death. Jose Tomas Canales is still alive. So basically, this is all in Spanish, but basically what this crazy story says, it's a sensationalized story, is that it's kind of this commentary on Mexican people, speaking to like elite Mexicans living in San Antonio, Mexican Americans, immigrant Mexicans crossing the border, but basically saying the time of superstition's over. The time of curanderos and brujos, like Don Pedrito is done. They had their day, but now we're intelligent, we're enlightened, right? So it was this kind of this takedown of the practice of curanderismo, something that was embarrassing. It should be embarrassing. And there was a backlash from much of the Mexican American community against this. The memories of Don Pedrito's cures and what he did were still fresh for many people, as they still are today. So there was letters to the editor, outpouring, and so the editor of this paper was friends with Jose Tomas Canales. And he said, can you help me out here, write an editorial? So he does. He writes an editorial responding to this. And basically in the editorial, what Canales says is that not only, right, so he starts talking about Don Pedrito, and he says, Don Pedrito healed people when doctors couldn't heal people. Don Pedrito had healed his mother, Tomasita Canales, which is really I think, their connection, their original connection. His mother was sick of something the doctors couldn't, his very wealthy father brought in doctors from San Antonio, and they're like, we don't know what's going on, she's not gonna make it. And so someone in the family says, go send for the curandero cure, and not everyone believed in Don Pedrito's power, and his father was like, no, we're not doing that, but they're desperate, and they did. And so as the story goes, it was Don Pedrito's receta that saved his mother. So he shares that story in defense of Don Pedrito, and then he pulls that story out to say, so not only was Don Pedrito as good as a medical doctor, maybe even better, but Mexican people also, right, can believe in curanderismo, and they're just as good as US citizens, right, just as smart, right, and so curanderismo is a legitimate healing practice, it's legitimate medicine, so he makes this broader argument about Mexican-American identity using Don Pedrito and curanderismo, which of course J.T. Canales as an advocate for Mexican Americans and the founder of LULAC, that was part of his whole thing. So it really makes sense that he would do this, but it's really fun to discover those connections and doing research and the way in which Don Pedrito entered that kind of conversation about identity in a border region that was quite contentious and still is, of course. So just a few more slides. So he dies in 1907, Don Pedrito, probably in his 90s. These are a couple different pictures of his funeral. You can see how many people came. And this picture, there's another picture that's even further back, that you can see people back on the hills to just show the love for him and this community. And then here, I love this one closer up, but it's a Mexican flag and it's an American flag. And they're both prominently, poised over his casket. Such a true Borderlands photo in a moment, in a border region where both Mexican identity and American identity are not exclusive but are combined. It just shows that, I feel, really beautifully for his funeral. And then Couple more slides. So as I mentioned, his legacy is still really strong, and many people still feel really kind of passionately and tenderly about Don Pedrito. There's a shrine in Los Olmos near where his rancho was. You can see kind of how rural it is in this picture. That's the outside of the shrine. There is a graveyard there, and his grave is somewhere over here. But inside, if you go inside, you'll see like rows of candles. Sometimes they're burning. People come in and there used to be a shop that you could buy a candle, but that's been closed. But people bring a candle, say a prayer. There is lots of Catholic iconography, so Virgin Mary or the Virgin of Guadalupe, the Mexican Virgin, Jesus, Mary, Joseph, lots of saints. I can't even show you all the different things. It's very humble, but you see the real mix of Catholic iconography and the kind of folk saint. People will bring items like if they feel that they've been healed, like crutches and things like that, so you'll sometimes see those things there. Also at the shrine, I've been there about 4 times doing research and going back to visit. There's a wall, I think there's 2 walls now with like corkboard that are just covered with notes, with people that having gone there to write a note and leaving it for Don Pedrito, asking him for healing. And I got permission to take these pictures. But I spent hours taking pictures of these, reading them, looking at them, thinking about them. There's everything from, this one, they're in English and Spanish, some are mixed. Please help me in my time of need. I believe in you, and I believe that you can help me and my family. Please keep us together and don't let anyone or anything separate us, me and my children and their father. Keep the bad out of all of our lives, hearts, and minds. In Jesus' name we pray that this may be done. So ones like this, ones that are more specific, please help my husband with alcoholism. Please help my son get out of prison. Please help me get a job at Walmart. Just the things of life, right, that you see on the wall there. To this day, that is still going. So I wanted to share those just to see how that legacy is really alive in this region. And then my friend Homero, who I mentioned, who just told me about that map, he lives in this region, and so when the book came out in 2021, he brought it to the shrine to get a blessing of his copy, and so he sent that to me. So really special to me. Broadly working on this book and this story has been. No, that's okay. I'm pretty much done, so that's pretty much.
I locked the door, and then somebody walked. There's a couple that.
That's great that people are interested.
I have the key, and I thought I locked it.
No worries, but yeah, so that's basically, my talk for you. I don't know if anyone has any questions or anything, or if not.
So when was he active? You said she started like in about 1899, 1900?
Yeah. He's the same, so they're the same time period. So he
didn't start until that late?
He was like 1880s. Yeah, he was much older than her whenever he crossed the border. He was probably, because I don't have a birth certificate for him, I don't know what age he was, but sources say he was maybe in his 90s when he died, and he died in 1907 and crossed the border around like the mid-1800s, like 88.
So was he doing that earlier down in his home state in Mexico?
I don't know. Yeah, I think on the little bit of research that I was able to do in Jalisco, there is a shrine that in Jalisco that mentions a Don Pedrito. And I've talked to people from there that they're like, oh yeah, we know Don Pedrito. But to me, it sounds like they know of his time healing on this side of the border, and those stories made it back. But that's the traces that I have. So, but the story that kind of circulates is that he was working as like a sheep herder in Jalisco, Mexico, and knocked off his horse one day, and that's when he then went unconscious, fell by a river, face got in the mud, and when he woke up, he had heard this voice, sort of similar, and his nose is kind of broken if you see closer pictures of him. And so that's sort of the story. There you can see his broken nose goes to his experience. But all that I've read and heard about him is that he was a farmer, a sheep herder, just kind of doing a little work here and there, that the father was out of the picture, and that when his mother died, he decided to leave and cross the border. So, but I think he probably was a healer before, right? But the time, how long he was, or the history of what that looked like there, wasn't able to find that in the same way that I could for Teresa Urrea. Good question. Yeah.
So do you see, I mean, obviously with these two, there's a difference kind of how they were treated, but a lot of that has to do with how she was a little more outspoken about the government and everything.
Right.
But do you see a lot of difference between the faith healers, the men and women, and how they're treated?
That's a great question. Like thinking just of these two, definitely if you read like the Mexican government, what they wrote about Teresa Urrea, because when she was kicked out of Mexico, the president had her followed, and there's whole like files and files of reports on her, where she was, what she was doing, and it's filled with language that's just so like, she's the puppet of her father. She's the puppet of this person. She doesn't know what she's doing. She's, just like very, all kind of what you would expect, right? But yet if she's just, not that powerful, then why is she right? But so a lot of tropes about, that are, I think, specifically kind of Mexican, in that a woman who steps out of bounds and is not under her father, is not under a man, is crazy, right? A lot of that kind of thing. And so a lot of the way that her healing is talked about, you have a lot of like derogatory comments, like people are superstitious, she's superstitious, they're just ignorant, she's convinced them, like all that kind of thing. Rarely do you see that about Don Pedrito, right? It's, so I think that's it's an interesting comparison, but also, their styles of healing are so different, in that at least there's not many stories or any stories of him like doing anything, like doing adjustments or touching or any of that. Is all the kind of, almost like the physician at his desk making assessments, which I think is interesting in terms of, but like so for these two, but in general, I think that I have met quite a few curanderas doing research, and just one curandero, I mean, I briefly talked to people, but because my research is historical, I'm back in this turn of the century period, I use my conversations with healers today more as like wanting just to know what they thought of this and what their practices were like. But I have seen within the community, Curanderismo community, that there can be a difference in the way that women's healing is understood and men's healing. So yeah, that's a really interesting question. And there even, there's always debates, right, in communities of healers. So there is this kind of ongoing debate between a couple of healers, one male, one female, and I think is that a bell?
There was something up there.
I hear like a little jingling.
Mm-hmm.
I think it might be our air conditioning up there. It's like in the wind.
But that's a great question. I mean, this is definitely the period too of, the kind of strict gender identities. And she really steps out of that by being a woman that never marries. Or she does marry and then is divorced right away. It's a weird story. She has 2 children out of wedlock. And so she's really kind of a rebel for her time period. She may not look like it because she's so beautiful and sweet and conforms to those things, but she definitely was someone who kind of forged a path that was really quite extraordinary for her time.
Do you see in the research, is there like more women, more men, about equal?
That's a good, so, I didn't really do ask those kinds of questions when I was doing research, in terms of, because I was just focused like on these 2 healers, but I will say that it seems like there are more women curanderas, and I think that's in many ways, and I think part of that is also a lot of the curanderas that you read about that aren't the famous ones, like these 2 that are just the community, are grandmas and mothers, and like even I've had students at Metro State who, when I've shared some of my research with them, are like, oh, I know my abuela is a curandera, or like, but and she just, people come over the house and they know that she can do this, and it's so it's more often I hear that it's women, but there are men curanderos as well, male, and even in if it's Brighton, again, I have a student that she's like, oh, there's this famous or for our neighborhood famous curandero on our street, and I was like, oh gosh, I'd love to meet him, but the book was already out, but so those are really great questions and thinking about like doing more contemporary study of this practice and what it looks like today. And there are some good books that are beginning to look at that.
So you said these two are very famous ones.
Yeah.
But how did you hear about them and why did you choose these two if there's others that are known to you?
So,
That type of thing.
yeah, great question. I love that question. So I found out first about her. So how I found out about Teresa Urrea was a book. So there are things written about her. So my book is not the first thing written about, actually either of them, but much more has been written about Teresa Urrea. So I found this book, or a colleague of mine, I worked at a bookstore when I was in grad school, and he's like, I think you like this book, it's called Teresita, it's about this really cool healer, and I'm like, what? This sounds interesting. Like something that I'm interested in the history of religion and things like that. So that kind of set me on the path to learn more about her. And then from that, so there's that book, and then a novelist, Luis Urrea, has written a couple of books about her life, The Hummingbird's Daughter and The Queen of America, that have won awards, and they're fiction, so it's historical fiction, but based upon her life and based upon research. He actually was one of the readers of my dissertation and shared his research with me. So because of those more famous publications about her, that's how I knew about her. So I first started going, I'm just interested in her. So I just read everything I could about her, and then some of my professors in grad school were like, which said, well, what about other healers could you put? And so from there, I just started to do searches. Really just first library word searches, curanderismo, curanderos, and then I learned about Don Pedrito. But there are others. There is Niño Fidencio, who's a little bit later. He's like the 1920s, so after they've died, but same border region. And I almost put those three together in a book, but it just got too big for me. And he never crossed the border. He stayed in Mexico, and I just made a choice, but if I had more time and maybe like more funding to do more research, it would be cool to put him together. There's also a healer who's not Mexican or Latino, Schlatter, and he passed through Colorado. And so he was this sort of German immigrant who healed kind of like she did, and he got all this, and so same time period as these two. There is a book about him, I forget the author's last name, which is pretty good. But I thought, and I also thought, oh, I'll put that in as three to put it in conversation. And again, it was just, this was almost like doing two different research projects, because there's a certain set of like research for her, and then there was, because they're not connected. So it just was more about, I found enough stuff on them, and because their lives were so close in timeline, and I could make some, those more broader contextualizations about the time, I chose them. And there's several others that I haven't mentioned that I came across, and I was always like, oh, maybe this person, maybe for my next project, but that's kind of what it came down to. It's a great question. Thank you.
So he used like herbal things, the onions, herbs, drink lots of water, whatever, and she used the earth.
She used the earth, her hands, and then also in what I didn't talk about, and in the second chapter on her, like more like energetic healing, like people would say that they could feel sparks of electricity coming from her hands. So I think almost like we call Reiki today, like you'll see pictures of her, I don't have here, where she's clapping people's hands and looking in their eyes. So kind of more the way like a spiritualist, a medium healer would heal, which Don Pedrito doesn't do, but yet, so she would do that kind of healing. When she was performing on stages in those cities, her healing is that it's grabbing onto the hands and looking in the eyes, or maybe sometimes energy healing, yeah, that and she would describe her healing that way. She's like, I send energy in, and sometimes I feel it come back to me, and I know I can't heal this person, but sometimes I can feel it, and it happens. So that part of her life is really interesting. When she's on her own in those cities, there's more interviews with her and newspapers where she talks about what is she experiencing and what does she think it is. And I'm actually writing an essay right now for an edited volume that potentially a press is gonna put out on just religion in the West. And they're like, can you write something about curanderismo or something? And I'm gonna write about that kind of energetic healing. Because I touch on it in the book, but there's a lot of stuff that I just didn't bring in because I didn't want to get too far away from the kind of the narrative. But she would describe herself, she's like, I'm an espiritista. She would say she didn't call herself a curandera or a santa, she called herself a spiritualist medium. That's how she identified herself. So, but she accepted that other people saw her as a saint or those kinds of things, but yeah. Great questions, but thank you so much. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
This was interesting.
That was really interesting, and we do have copies of the book for sale as well if you are interested in that. So,
No pressure.
and thank you so much for presenting.
Yes.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Kathleen. It's a pleasure. I'm gonna come here again and just check out the museum and
Yes,
walk
definitely.
around this beautiful town.
We hope you will.